Picture a guided anti-ship missile hurtling toward your vessel at 500 miles per hour. Now realize that this missile does not rely on radar or infrared sensors for its terminal guidance. Its guidance system is a 20-year-old pilot with a samurai sword in the cockpit, a photograph of his family tucked into his flight suit, and a one-way ticket to eternity. This was the terrifying reality for the United States Navy in the spring of 1945. We are talking about the Battle of Okinawa, where the Imperial Japanese military launched over 1,900 suicide missions in a desperate, blood-soaked bid to annihilate the American fleet. It was the most severe test of courage, discipline, and anti-aircraft gunnery in the history of naval warfare. Welcome back to the channel. If you appreciate deep, uncompromising military analysis that looks beyond the Hollywood myths and digs right into the tactical realities of history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We rely on viewers like you to keep the analytical fires burning. So let us know in the comments which battle you want us to tear apart next. Let us rewind the clock and look at the grand strategic chessboard in early 1945. The Empire of Japan was bleeding out from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. The Marianas Turkey Shoot had gutted their naval aviation arm beyond repair. The Philippines campaign had shattered their surface fleet and severed their critical oil supply lines to the Dutch East Indies. American B-29 superfortresses were systematically turning the wooden industrial cities of Honshu into ash. The United States military machine was a juggernaut of unmatched industrial capacity, grinding its way across the Pacific with a logistical tail that stretched thousands of miles back to the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of Brooklyn. But the closer the Americans got to the Japanese home islands, the fiercer the resistance became. The strategic objective for the Allies was clear. The United States needed a massive staging ground for Operation Downfall, the planned amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands. That staging ground was Okinawa, a rugged, heavily fortified island in the Ryukyu chain, located just 340 miles south of Kyushu. Taking Okinawa would provide the airfields necessary to dominate the skies over Japan, and the deep-water anchorages required to stage a fleet of unprecedented size. The Japanese High Command in Tokyo knew exactly what the Americans were planning. They also knew they could not win a conventional war of maneuver or attrition. Their industrial base was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing and relentless submarine blockades. Their experienced pilots were mostly dead, resting at the bottom of the Pacific from Midway to the Philippine Sea. So they changed the math. The Japanese strategy fundamentally shifted to a doctrine known as Ketsugo, or decisive operation. The goal was no longer military victory in the traditional sense, but political exhaustion. The Japanese High Command believed that if they could inflict catastrophic, unacceptable casualties on the American forces at Okinawa, the American public would lose their stomach for a bloody invasion of the home islands. This would theoretically force Washington to the negotiating table to sign a peace treaty that preserved the imperial system, and avoided unconditional surrender. Does this strategy sound familiar? It should. We saw a remarkably similar calculus in the American Civil War during the summer of 1864. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, bleeding men and resources he could not replace, dug into the brutal trench warfare at Cold Harbor and Petersburg. Lee knew he could not march on Washington and win the war outright. His entire strategic objective was to inflict such horrific casualties on Ulysses Grant's Army of the Potomac that the Northern public would grow war-weary and vote Abraham Lincoln out of office in the November elections. The Japanese were playing the exact same political waiting game, using American blood as their primary currency. But to extract that blood at sea, the Japanese needed a weapon that negated the overwhelming American advantage in radar, fighter direction, and proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Enter the Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the special attack units, known to history and the terrified American sailors simply as the Kamikaze, or Divine Wind. The concept of suicide attacks was not entirely new to naval warfare. We had seen isolated, spontaneous incidents earlier in the war when heavily damaged planes crashed into ships. But it was Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi who institutionalized and weaponized the tactic during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Onishi, a pragmatic and ruthless tactician, realized that a hastily trained pilot in an obsolete aircraft had zero chance of surviving a conventional dogfight with a veteran American aviator flying a Grumman F-6F Hellcat or a Vought F-4U Corsair. However, if that same rookie pilot was instructed to bypass the dogfight and simply dive his bomb-laden aircraft directly into the wooden flight deck of an American carrier, his chances of securing a hit increased exponentially. A conventional dive bomber had to brave heavy anti-aircraft fire, drop its payload at the precise moment, and pull away, often missing a maneuvering ship. A kamikaze was a smart bomb that constantly adjusted its trajectory all the way down to the point of impact. Leyte Gulf proved the morbid concept worked, but Okinawa was where the Japanese military industrialized the practice of suicide on a massive scale. Let us examine the immense forces arrayed on this watery battlefield. On the American side, you had the United States Fifth Fleet under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, a man known for his cold, calculating intellect and flawless execution at Midway. The striking arm of the Fifth Fleet was Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher. This was the fast carrier task force, the most lethal concentration of naval air power the world had ever seen. We are talking about an armada of over 1,500 vessels. The logistical footprint alone is staggering to comprehend. To support this massive fleet far from home ports, the United States Navy deployed dedicated service squadrons, specifically Service Squadron 10. This was effectively a floating city of oilers, ammunition ships, repair dry docks, and supply vessels that provided everything from aviation fuel and spare radar tubes to fresh ice cream for the combat ships while underway. The operational backbone of the fleet consisted of the Essex-class fleet carriers, displacing over 30,000 tons and carrying up to 90 aircraft each. These flat tops were guarded by a steel wall of fast battleships like the Iowa-class, heavy cruisers, and dozens of Fletcher, Allen M. Sumner, and Gearing-class destroyers. The American technological edge in 1945 was terrifyingly sharp. The airspace around the fleet was constantly monitored by advanced surface search and air search radars. When incoming bogies were detected, fighter direction officers aboard the carriers would vector combat air patrols to intercept the threat 50 to 100 miles away from the ships. If enemy aircraft managed to slip past the fighters, they faced the most sophisticated anti-aircraft defense network in human history. The American ships were bristling with guns. A typical Essex-class carrier mounted 12 5-inch, 38-caliber dual-purpose guns, up to 72 Bofors 40mm cannons, and as many as 76 Oerlikon 20mm cannons. But the real game-changer, the ace in the hole for the US Navy, was the Mark 32 variable time fuse, commonly known as the proximity fuse. Developed in absolute secrecy alongside the Manhattan Project, this fuse contained a miniature, shock-proof radio transmitter and receiver built directly into the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell. It bounced a continuous radio wave off the target aircraft. When the shell got within lethal fragmentation range, usually about 70 feet, the returning signal triggered a switch, and the shell detonated automatically. You no longer had to actually hit the airplane with a direct strike, nor did you have to perfectly calculate the altitude for a timed fuse. You just had to get the shell close. This single invention increased the lethality of American heavy anti-aircraft fire by an estimated factor of 5. Against this technological leviathan, the Japanese deployed Operation Tengo. Their surface fleet was a shadow of its former self, essentially reduced to a one-way suicide mission for the super battleship Yamato, which was ordered to beach itself on Okinawa and act as a static fortress. The real threat to the Fifth Fleet was entirely in the air. The Japanese amassed thousands of aircraft on heavily camouflaged airfields across Kyushu and Formosa. These were not the elite, carrier-trained squadrons of 1941. These were a hodgepodge of obsolete trainers, worn-out fighters, and whatever else could be made to fly. You had Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, Aichi D3 Val dive bombers, and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars. The pilots were often young university students drafted into service, given barely enough flight training to take off, navigate in a straight line to a designated coordinate, and push their aircraft into a terminal dive. They were explicitly not taught how to land, because landing was not on the itinerary. Their training focused heavily on spiritual preparation and the Bushido Code, conditioning them to accept death as an honor. But it would be a fatal analytical mistake to assume the Japanese relied solely on improvised, obsolete weapons for this campaign. They also developed purpose-built terror weapons specifically designed for the Kamikaze campaign. The most notorious and technologically advanced of these was the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, which translates to cherry blossom. The Americans gave it a different name, They called it the Baka bomb, which is Japanese for idiot. But there was absolutely nothing idiotic about its tactical capabilities. The Ohka was a manned, rocket-powered flying bomb. Because it had incredibly short range, it had to be carried to within striking distance, tucked underneath the belly of a Mitsubishi G4M Betty twin-engine bomber. Once the mothership reached the target area and released the weapon, the Ohka pilot ignited 3 solid propellant rocket motors. This accelerated the flying coffin to over 600 miles per hour in a shallow, unpowered glide, culminating in a terminal dive. Packed into the nose of the Ohka was a devastating 2,646-pound armor-piercing warhead. At 600 miles per hour, the Ohka was virtually impossible to intercept with the piston-engine fighters and manual anti-aircraft guns of the era. The only real defense was to shoot down the slow, lumbering Betty bomber before it could release the Ohka. If an Ohka pilot got a clean release, the target ship was in grave, immediate peril. The tactical clash at Okinawa was a brutal, uncompromising collision of opposing doctrines. The American naval doctrine relied on a system of defense in depth. The outer layer was the combat air patrol. The fighters tasked with intercepting and destroying the enemy before they could even see the masts of the fleet. The middle layer was the 5-inch anti-aircraft fire, throwing up a massive, invisible wall of proximity-fused flak. The inner layer was the terrifyingly dense curtain of 40mm and 20mm automatic weapons fire, designed to physically shred anything that got within a few thousand yards of the hull. The Japanese doctrine engineered to counter this layered defense was mass saturation. They knew perfectly well that sending kamikazes in 1s and 2s was a total waste of life and machinery. The American defenses would simply swat them out of the sky with ease. So the Japanese planned the Kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum attacks. These were massive, highly coordinated waves involving hundreds of aircraft, attacking simultaneously from different altitudes, different vectors, and at different times of day. The logic behind the Kikusui attacks was cold, calculated, and mathematically sound. If you throw 300 aircraft at a fleet in a single hour, the American fighters might shoot down 200 of them. The 5-inch guns might get 50. The light anti-aircraft guns might shred 40. But that leaves 10 aircraft that will inevitably slip through the defensive screen and smash into the flight decks of the carriers or the superstructures of the destroyers. It is a brutal calculus of deliberate accepted attrition. Does it make sense to trade a $300 airplane and a minimally trained pilot for a 30,000-ton aircraft carrier and 1,000 American sailors? In the twisted, desperate logic of total war, it absolutely does. To protect the main body of the fleet and the highly vulnerable transport ships unloading the invasion force on the beaches of Okinawa, Admiral Spruance had to deploy a robust early warning system. He established a ring of radar picket stations around the island, stretching out into the ocean for nearly 100 miles. These stations were manned by destroyers, destroyer escorts, and smaller amphibious support vessels. Their job was to scan the skies with their air search radars, detect the incoming Japanese formations as early as possible, and direct the combat air patrol to intercept. They were the tripwire of the American fleet. But in military tactics, being the tripwire means you are the very first thing the enemy trips over. The radar pickets were isolated, operating far from the mutual support and overlapping anti-aircraft umbrellas of the main fleet. They were sitting ducks on the open ocean. This deployment heavily echoes the use of cavalry screens in earlier ground conflicts. Think of Union General John Buford's dismounted cavalry at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Buford intentionally pushed his troopers far out in front of the main Union army to make contact with the advancing Confederates. He traded space for time, taking the brunt of the initial assault to allow the main body of the army to deploy onto the high ground. The destroyers on the radar picket lines at Okinawa served the exact same sacrificial function. They were put in harm's way to buy time and provide targeting data for the carriers. The men on those destroyers knew exactly what their job was, and they knew the horrific risks involved. Some crews even painted large white arrows on their decks, pointing toward the main fleet, hoping the kamikazes would fly past them to the juicier targets over the horizon. The Japanese pilots, however, were often disoriented, stressed, and running low on fuel, so they simply took the very first target of opportunity they saw, which was usually a lonely destroyer on a radar picket station. The strategic pieces were locked into place, and the tactical doctrines were set on an unavoidable collision course. The greatest naval armada in human history was anchored off the coast of Okinawa, vulnerable and tethered to the massive amphibious assault happening on the beaches. Hundreds of miles away, on the hidden airfields of Kyushu, thousands of young men were drinking a final ceremonial cup of sake, tying headbands emblazoned with the rising sun around their flight helmets, and climbing into cockpits they would never climb out of. The radar picket destroyers were steaming toward their lonely stations, their crews scanning the horizon with a growing, suffocating sense of dread. The air over the Pacific was thick with tension, the calm before a metallic, fiery storm that would change naval warfare forever. What happens when the first massive Kikusui wave of 355 suicide planes darkens the sky and descends upon the isolated, outgunned destroyers of the radar picket line? April 6, 1945, marked the beginning of Kikusui No. 1, and the reality of this new aerial warfare immediately shattered any American illusions of a quick, conventional victory. To understand the absolute meat grinder that these radar picket stations became, we must first break down the tactical geometry of a kamikaze assault. The Japanese attackers did not fly in neat, predictable formations like the German Luftwaffe over Europe. They employed a highly decentralized, swarm-based doctrine. A typical attack wave would split into multiple altitudes. High-level bogies would circle at 20,000 feet, drawing the attention of the American Combat Air Patrol and the shipboard air search radars. Meanwhile, the real killers were coming in on the deck. Japanese pilots learned to fly their Zeros and Vals mere feet above the ocean swells, a tactic known as wave hopping. By staying this low, they hid beneath the curvature of the Earth and the radar horizon, effectively blinding the American SK and SC radar sets until the aircraft was less than 10 miles away. At 300 miles per hour, 10 miles translates to roughly 2 minutes of warning time. 2 minutes to detect the threat, identify it as hostile, transmit the coordinates from the Combat Information Center to the gun directors, slew the massive 5-inch gun mounts onto the target, and commence firing. How do you fight an enemy who has already accepted his own death before he even starts the engine? The answer is with a wall of lead, steel, and high explosives so dense that it physically disintegrates the aircraft before its kinetic energy can reach the hull. But the physics of a kamikaze strike are horrifying. A fully fueled Mitsubishi A6M0, carrying a 500-pound armor-piercing bomb, weighs roughly 6,000 pounds. If you shoot the pilot, the plane does not stop. If you destroy the engine, the plane does not stop. Momentum and gravity take over. Unless the American anti-aircraft fire could literally saw the wings off the aircraft or detonate the bomb in mid-air, that 6,000 pounds of flaming metal and high-octane aviation fuel was going to hit the ship. The aviation fuel was often the deadliest component. When a kamikaze struck a destroyer, the sheer kinetic impact would rupture the plane's fuel tanks, sending hundreds of gallons of burning gasoline cascading down the ship's superstructure, into the ventilation shafts, and down into the engine rooms. This tactical nightmare mirrors the brutal realities faced by the American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division during the Siege of Bastogne in the winter of 1944. Just like the paratroopers, surrounded in the Ardennes forest, the sailors on the radar picket lines were cut off from the main body, surrounded by a hostile environment, taking fire from all 360 degrees, and serving as the indispensable human tripwire that protected the larger strategic force. The destroyers had nowhere to hide, no terrain to mask their radar signatures, and no ability to retreat without leaving the aircraft carriers of Task Force 58 completely blind and vulnerable. On the afternoon of April 6th, Radar Picket Station 1, located about 40 miles north of Okinawa, became the focal point of the Japanese fury. The station was manned by the destroyer USS Bush, a 2,000-ton Fletcher-class ship. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky turned into a hornet's nest. The radar screens in the Combat Information Center of the Bush became completely saturated with white blips. The Japanese were coming from every point on the compass. The Bush's 5-inch, 38-caliber guns began pounding the sky, hurling proximity-fused shells at a rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute per barrel. The noise on the deck was deafening, a continuous concussive roar that shattered eardrums and shook the ship down to its keel. The gun crews, many of them teenagers who had been in high school just 2 years prior, operated in a state of pure adrenaline-fueled automation. Loaders slammed 54-pound shells into the breeches, the brass casings ejecting onto the steel decks in a growing, clattering pile. Despite throwing up a magnificent wall of flak, the sheer mathematics of the Kikusui swarm caught up with the bush. At 3:15, a low-flying Kamikaze slipped through the defensive curtain and slammed directly into the ship's forward engine room. The explosion was catastrophic. The blast severed the main steam lines, immediately killing the engineering crew and deadening the ship in the water. A destroyer without power is a sitting duck. The sister ship, USS Colquhoun, patrolling nearby, saw the smoke and raced in at 30 knots to provide anti-aircraft cover and rescue survivors. This was exactly what the Japanese swarm commanders wanted. By crippling one ship, they drew in another. As the Colquhoun maneuvered around the burning bush, a fresh wave of kamikazes descended. The Colquhoun's gunners fought like demons, shooting down 3 attackers in rapid succession. But you only have to miss once. A heavy bomber, likely a twin-engine Betty, crashed into the Colquhoun's main deck, obliterating the after-fire room and rupturing the fuel oil tanks. Within hours, both the bush and the Colquhoun, shattered and burning from stem to stern, slipped beneath the waves of the Pacific. It was a stark, bloody demonstration of the Kikusui doctrine's effectiveness. The physical and psychological toll on the American sailors during these weeks is almost impossible to overstate. The fleet was kept at general quarters, the highest state of battle readiness, for days on end. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. Men ate cold rations from tinned cans while sitting on their ammunition boxes, their eyes constantly scanning the overcast, low-sailing skies. The weather in the East China Sea during April is notoriously miserable, characterized by heavy cloud cover, rain squalls, and fog. This weather heavily favored the Japanese. A kamikaze pilot could navigate above the clouds, locate the American fleet through gaps in the overcast, and then execute a terminal dive, popping out of the cloud base at 2,000 feet. For the American gunners, this meant they had perhaps 5 seconds to acquire the target, track it, and destroy it before impact. Combat fatigue spread through the fleet like a virus. Men hallucinated bogies in the empty clouds. The continuous vibrating shock waves of their own ship's guns caused micro-concussions. Yet, amidst this unrelenting horror, the United States Navy demonstrated a level of damage control and sheer operational resilience that remains a benchmark in naval history. To understand this resilience, we must look at the legendary engagement of the USS Laffey, an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, on April 16th during Kikusui No. 3. The Laffey was assigned to Radar Picket Station 1, the exact same cursed coordinates where the Bush and Colquhoun had been annihilated 10 days prior. Commanded by Commander Frederick Beckton, a seasoned officer who had already survived. Having his previous ship sunk out from under him, the Laffey was about to face the ultimate test of ship survivability. At 8:30 in the morning, the radar operators reported a massive incoming formation. Over 50 Japanese aircraft were vectored toward Picket Station 1. Beckton ordered his ship to flank speed, maneuvering violently to throw off the attackers' aim. The engagement that followed lasted for 80 uninterrupted minutes of pure, concentrated hell. The Japanese did not attack in a single mass. They came in waves of 2, 3, and 4 aircraft, attacking from the bow, the stern, and both beams simultaneously. The Laffey's gunners were phenomenal. The 5-inch guns, directed by the ship's Mark 37 fire control system, swatted the first few attackers out of the sky at long range. But the swarm was too dense. The Japanese pilots realized the heavy guns were deadly, so they shifted their tactics, coming in low to get under the firing depression limit of the main battery. This forced the defense to rely on the light anti-aircraft weapons, the twin 40mm Bofors and the single 20mm Oerlikons. These weapons required immense physical courage to operate. The gunners were strapped into open mounts, completely exposed to enemy strafing fire and the impending explosions. What goes through the mind of a 19-year-old gunner's mate when he sees a Mitsubishi Zero barreling through a wall of flak, aiming right for his mount? There is no time for fear, only the rhythmic, brutal mechanics of keeping the weapon fed and the trigger depressed. At 8:45, the Laffey's luck began to run out. A kamikaze clipped the ship's superstructure, showering the deck with aviation fuel. Minutes later, a second plane crashed directly into the aft 20mm gun mounts, instantly killing the crews and igniting a massive fire in the handling rooms directly above the ship's aft magazines. If the fire reached the powder magazines, the Laffey would be vaporized. The damage control parties, operating in thick, choking smoke and intense heat, dragged hoses across the slippery, blood-slicked decks. They manually flooded the aft magazines, sacrificing their own ammunition supply to save the ship from a catastrophic internal explosion. But the Japanese kept coming. A bomb dropped by a passing plane jammed the Laffey's rudder hard over to one side. The destroyer was now locked in a tight, continuous circle, unable to maneuver, a stationary target in a shooting gallery. 2 more kamikazes slammed into the aft section of the ship, completely destroying the aft 5-inch gun mount and crushing the steel bulkheads like tin foil. The situation on the bridge was desperate. The ship was on fire. Down by the stern, heavily flooded, and steering was gone. A junior officer, looking at the absolute devastation, turned to Commander Beckton and asked if they should give the order to abandon ship. Beckton, staring out at the burning wreckage of his command, delivered a line that defines the ethos of the surface warfare officer. He calmly replied, "I will never abandon ship as long as a gun will fire." And the guns kept firing, even as their mounts were surrounded by flames. The surviving 40mm gunners manually cranked their weapons, tracking incoming planes and shredding them at point-blank range. By the time the American Combat Air Patrol finally arrived in sufficient numbers to chase off the remaining Japanese aircraft, the Laffey had been hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. The ship was a floating junkyard of twisted steel, dead bodies and burning fuel, but she was still afloat. The stand of the USS Laffey is the naval equivalent of Colonel Joshua Chamberlain's defense of Little Round Top at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Just as the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment held the extreme left flank of the Union line against overwhelming Confederate assaults, refusing to yield ground even when their ammunition ran out, the crew of the Laffey held the extreme outer perimeter of the Fifth Fleet. They absorbed punishment that by all laws of physics and naval engineering should have sunk them 3 times over. They held the line because they knew that every kamikaze that crashed into their battered hull was a kamikaze that would not reach the vulnerable troop transports and aircraft carriers over the horizon. But the radar picket line, as heroic as it was a porous shield. The Kikusui waves were too massive, the ocean was too vast, and the American destroyers were taking unsustainable losses. Admiral Spruance was watching his screening force get systematically dismantled. Ships were being towed back to the anchorage at Kerama-Retto with their bows blown off, their superstructures melted, and their decks covered in the grim, canvas-wrapped bodies of American sailors, the Japanese High Command in Tokyo, receiving highly exaggerated reports of sinking American battleships and carriers from the surviving escort pilots, believed their Ketsugo strategy was working perfectly. They believed the American fleet was on the verge of collapse, so they doubled down. They ordered even larger waves, pulling every available aircraft from training squadrons and reserve depots. They were preparing to bypass the bleeding destroyers on the picket line and drive a dagger directly into the heart of Task Force 58. The focus of the battle was about to shift from the desperate, localized brawls on the horizon to a massive, apocalyptic clash of heavy metal over the main American fleet. What happens when the kamikaze swarms break through the outer defenses and find themselves staring down the wooden flight decks of the Essex-class fleet carriers, the very nerve center of the United States Navy's offensive power? When the massive Kikusui swarms finally managed to bleed the radar picket destroyers dry and bypass the outer defensive rings, they found themselves staring down the ultimate prize of the Pacific War. The core of Task Force 58 consisted of the mighty Essex-class fleet carriers, the heavily armored Iowa-class fast battleships, and a dense, interlocking screen of cruisers. This was the absolute nerve center of American offensive power, projecting a lethal umbrella of aviation over the amphibious landings at Okinawa. But the Japanese attackers possessed a terrifying tactical advantage that exploited a fundamental design flaw in the American carriers. To understand this flaw, we have to look at the naval architecture of the era. The United States Navy designed its carriers with wooden flight decks built over an unarmored hangar deck. Why build carriers with highly flammable wooden decks when the enemy is dropping high explosives from the sky? The answer lies in the American naval doctrine, which prioritized overwhelming offensive aircraft capacity over passive defensive survivability. A wooden flight deck meant a significantly lighter topside, allowing an Essex-class carrier to operate up to 100 aircraft. In stark contrast, the British Royal Navy built their carriers, like the HMS Illustrious, with heavily armoured steel flight decks, which restricted their air groups to roughly 50 planes. The American strategy was a calculated gamble, trading heavy armor for maximum striking power. This mirrors the exact same industrial doctrine the United States Army employed in the European theater with the M4 Sherman tank. American planners knew the Sherman was under-armored and undergunned compared to the massive German Tiger and Panther tanks. However, the Sherman was mechanically reliable, easy to mass-produce, and easy to ship across the Atlantic in massive numbers. The American military philosophy was always about winning through sheer volume, logistical superiority, and offensive mass, accepting that lighter armor would inevitably lead to tactical losses. But on the morning of May 11th, 1945, that calculated gamble was called in, and the payment was extracted in blood. The flagship of Task Force 58, the USS Bunker Hill, was operating off the coast of Okinawa, preparing to launch a massive strike against the Japanese home islands. The wooden flight deck was a chaotic, highly combustible environment. 34 aircraft, including Vought F-4U Corsairs, Grumman F-6F Hellcats, and Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers, were fully fueled, armed to the teeth with rockets and 500-pound bombs, and packed tightly together on the aft end of the flight deck with their engines warming up. The ship's aviation fuel system was actively pumping thousands of gallons of high-octane avgas into the planes. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a low-flying Mitsubishi Zero, piloted by Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa, emerged from the low cloud cover. He had completely evaded the radar net. Ogawa dropped a 550-pound, armor-piercing bomb that punched straight through the wooden flight deck and detonated in the gallery deck, right among the ready rooms packed with American pilots. Seconds later, Ogawa crashed his Zero directly into the mass of few aircraft on the flight deck. The physical reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The kinetic impact ruptured the fuel tanks of the parked Corsairs, instantly creating a massive, rolling fireball that consumed the aft end of the ship. Before the damage control parties could even react to the first strike, a second Kamikaze, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, plunged out of the overcast and slammed into the flight deck near the island superstructure. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The ship's ventilation system, designed to pull fresh air into the lower decks, instead sucked thick, toxic, burning smoke down into the engineering spaces and the hangar deck. The USS Bunker Hill was gripped by a raging inferno that threatened to reach the lower ammunition magazines, which would have vaporized the 30,000-ton vessel instantly. The survival of the Bunker Hill is a testament to the brutal, uncompromising efficiency of American naval damage control. Cruisers and destroyers pulled alongside the burning behemoth, risking their own destruction to spray thousands of gallons of water and chemical foam onto the blazing flight deck. The crew of the Bunker Hill, operating in pitch-black, smoke-filled corridors with the deck plates melting beneath their boots, manually jettisoned armed bombs into the ocean and flooded the magazines. They saved the ship, but the human cost was staggering. 390 sailors and aviators were killed, and another 264 were wounded. Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher, the commander of the task force, was forced to evacuate his burning flagship and transfer his command via a breeches buoy to a nearby destroyer. Mitscher eventually moved his flag to the legendary USS Enterprise, the most decorated ship in United States naval history. But the Enterprise was not immune to the mathematics of the kamikaze swarm. Just 3 days later, on May 14th, a lone Japanese pilot named Tomizai managed to slip through the combat air patrol. Flying a bomb-laden Zero, he executed a steep dive through a blizzard of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire and planted his aircraft squarely on the forward elevator of the Enterprise. The blast blew the massive multi-ton steel elevator 400 feet into the air, completely destroying the forward flight deck and knocking the legendary carrier out of the war for good. The Japanese had successfully neutralized 2 of the most powerful warships on the planet in a matter of days, using 2 obsolete aircraft and 2 minimally trained pilots. Did the Japanese High Command truly believe that throwing teenagers into the ocean would win the war outright? No, they did not. The Japanese leadership was executing a strategy of political exhaustion, and from a purely analytical standpoint, it was working. The intelligence flowing back to Washington was grim. The casualty lists from the Fifth Fleet were unprecedented. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the United States Navy would suffer nearly 5,000 dead sailors, making it the bloodiest battle in the history of the Navy. More American sailors died at Okinawa than American soldiers or Marines on the island itself. The fleet had lost 36 ships sunk and nearly 400 damaged. The political ramifications of these numbers were seismic. We can draw a direct historical parallel to the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968. During the Tet Offensive, Communist forces launched massive coordinated surprise attacks across South Vietnam. Tactically, the United States and Allied forces crushed the offensive, inflicting catastrophic casualties on the Viet Cong. But strategically and politically, the Tet Offensive was a massive victory for North Vietnam. The sheer scale, ferocity, and unexpected nature of the attacks broadcasted directly into American living rooms, shattered the public's illusion that the war was almost won. It broke the political will of the Johnson administration. The Kamikaze campaign at Okinawa had the exact same psychological effect on the American High Command. President Harry Truman and his top military advisors, including General George Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, looked at the butcher's bill from Okinawa and extrapolated those numbers to Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The intelligence intercepts, codenamed Magic, revealed that the Japanese had hoarded over 10,000 aircraft in Kyushu specifically for kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet. If a few thousand obsolete planes at Okinawa could inflict such horrific damage on the Fifth Fleet, what would 10,000 planes do to a stationary invasion armada anchored off the beaches of Kyushu? The American military projected that an invasion of Japan could cost up to 1 million American casualties. The Ketsugo strategy had successfully created a tactical nightmare that forced a strategic pivot. The Kamikazes did not save the Japanese Empire, they doomed it. By proving that a conventional invasion would be a bloodbath of unacceptable proportions, the Kamikaze campaign provided the ultimate mathematical and political justification for the United States to deploy the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The suicide pilots forced the American leadership to seek an alternative method of ending the war, one that relied on absolute, city-leveling destruction rather than amphibious attrition. The tactical legacy of the Kamikaze campaign fundamentally altered the trajectory of global military technology. The United States Navy learned a terrifying lesson in the East China Sea. They realized that conventional anti-aircraft artillery, even when guided by radar and equipped with proximity fuses, was ultimately insufficient against a fast-moving, guided threat. You cannot simply damage a guided weapon. You must completely obliterate its aerodynamic integrity before it reaches your ship. This realization birthed Project Bumblebee, a top-secret Navy research program initiated in 1945 to develop ramjet-powered, radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. The Kamikaze was the biological, human-piloted predecessor to the modern anti-ship cruise missile. Fast forward to the Falklands War in 1982. The Argentine military deployed French-made Exocet missiles against the British Royal Navy. An Exocet is essentially a robotic kamikaze. It is a sea-skimming, radar-evading weapon designed to bypass traditional air defenses and deliver a lethal kinetic and explosive payload directly into the hull of a ship. When an Exocet slammed into the British destroyer HMS Sheffield, it proved that the tactical concept, pioneered by the Japanese at Okinawa, had fully evolved into the missile age. The United States Navy's modern Aegis combat system, with its phased array radars and standard missiles designed to track and destroy hundreds of incoming targets simultaneously, is a direct technological descendant of the desperate, bloody lessons learned on the radar picket lines off Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa was a crucible of fire that tested the limits of human endurance and naval engineering. The Imperial Japanese military, stripped of its conventional power, weaponized the very soul of its youth, turning desperation into a devastating tactical doctrine. They traded lives for time and metal for blood in a campaign that remains the largest and most destructive naval battle in modern history. The United States Navy, caught in the crosshairs of this unprecedented suicide offensive, survived not through tactical brilliance, but through the sheer, brute force resilience of its industrial base and the unimaginable courage of the sailors manning the anti-aircraft batteries on the shattered, burning decks of the fleet. The dark waters off Okinawa hold the wreckage of hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft, a silent, rusting testament to the terrifying lengths to which a dying empire will go, and the terrible price required to defeat it. War is not a clash of ideals. It is a brutal equation of logistics, technology, and the raw human capacity to absorb and inflict violence. Which factor do you believe was the most critical in the United States Navy surviving the kamikaze onslaught at Okinawa? Was it A, the overwhelming industrial capacity and rapid damage control capabilities of the American fleet. B. The advanced technology of radar and proximity-fused ammunition. Or C. The sheer suicidal bravery of the radar picket destroyers absorbing the initial blows. Let us know your tactical assessment in the comments below, and make sure you are subscribed so you never miss a briefing.